To Casa Italiana. My name is Stefano Albertini. I'm the director. It's a great pleasure to welcome back to the Casa Dacia Maraini. We were trying to reconstruct the exact date of her last appearance here, and we seem to have reached the agreement that it must have been 1997 when she was teaching at Harvard a seminar on Italian women writers. And she came here to talk about her novel La lunga vita di Mariano Cria. So it's a great pleasure to welcome her back. As you know, Dacia Maraini is one of the most prominent Italian writers, active in a variety of different literary fields, including theater, prose, essay writing. And she has just published in Italy her new book dedicated to Chiara di Assisi, In Praise of Disobedience is the subtitle, in case some of you were thinking of a submitted woman that would always say yes to anything. The book is extremely interesting, obviously very well written, and it presents a completely new perspective on Chiara di Assisi. Dacia Maraini is not new to an interest for mysticism, sanctity, and issues related to these topics, and especially the connection between women and mysticism, women and sanctity. So how do women achieve status of sanctity in a male-dominated society like the Roman Catholic Church? And therefore, this book is just a further step in her in-depth exploration of these issues. And we couldn't be more lucky than having Jane Tylus in our own Department of Italian Studies. Many of you know Professor Tylus for several other presentations that she gave here. She's a scholar of Italian literature and comparative literature, and she has concentrated her interest on Italian writers of the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Her most recent book is dedicated to Santa Caterina da Siena, St. Catherine of Siena, another mystic, and Mrs. Maraini wrote a theatrical piece on Caterina da Siena, so they have this thing in common. And Jane concentrated in her book on Caterina as a writer. As you know, there are all the issue of Caterina having a secretary who was a friar. Did she really write? Did she only dictate? Who is the author? Who writes or who dictates? And these and many other issues are addressed by Jane in her brilliant book on Caterina da Siena. So I have these two wonderful women here, and I'm going to go down and listen to them very carefully. And please welcome Dacia Maraini and Jane Tylus.
Grazie, Stefano. Thank you for this lovely introduction. It is a real pleasure and honor for me to be with Dacia Maraini tonight, and such a delight to have read her book over the past few weeks on Chiara di Assisi. Certainly one of the most, if not the most, important women saints of the Middle Ages. And just to give you very briefly, as an audience, a very brief sense of this remarkable book, if I might, unless, Dacia, you would like to do it instead.
Please.
It has a very interesting and I would say unusual and very original structure. It starts out with letters of a young girl who is also named Chiara Mandala, a Sicilian, very young girl, teenager perhaps, early 20s, 19. Who is writing someone who is simply called cara scrittrice, clearly Dacia Maraini herself, trying to interest her in writing a new book on Chiara of Assisi. And these letters eventually become more and more feisty, I guess I would say, and persuasive. And finally, la cara scrittrice breaks down and says, all right, I'll write the book. It's much more subtle than this. But after she says this, Chiara then disappears. We move from what are essentially email exchanges to a kind of diary format, or quaderni, taccuini, notes that la cara scrittrice is writing to herself about Chiara. I can imagine her with stacks of books on her table. And then after a certain point, towards the end of this romanzo, if it's, one question is, what kind of genre is this? Is it a romanzo? The young Chiara suddenly returns. And so the book actually closes with a letter from Chiara to the cara scrittrice, a Chiara who's very, very grateful that the scrittrice has taken on this project. And in fact, the last word of her letter, which ends the book, is amore. And I think that it's interesting to think about this book that's about really two Chiaras, the modern Sicilian Chiara, who has an interesting history in and of herself that maybe Dacia Maraini will talk a little bit more about, but also, of course, it's an attempt to capture in the 21st century the life of this extraordinary 13th century other Chiara, the Chiara of Assisi. So perhaps I would just start with that very brief framework, and there'll be some questions to come about that structure and its meaning. Stefano, suggested that the subtitle, Praise of Disobedience, right, is a very unexpected, surprising subtitle. And could you perhaps talk a little bit about Claire and disobedience?
Yes, it's a sort of strategy, because she had the ability of being obedient and respectful to the authority of the church. She never put herself against the church, never. Mm-hmm. She never said a word of criticism against. But in the practice, she was disobeying. This was the difficult strategy, because it was not easy, no? But she didn't want to make a war. She didn't want to criticize the church from outside. She wanted to change it from inside. Mm-hmm. This was the clever idea, but it was not easy, because the church didn't like, well, her radicality, I would say, no? Mm-hmm. She was radical, for example, in the choosing of poverty, what she called il privilegio della povertà, mm-hmm. the privilege of poverty, which for the first time that the Pope received a letter asking for this privilege of poverty, he was laughing, because all the convent usually were asking for money. They were asking for proprieties. They had to have propriety, because specifically female convents, because they were closed. They couldn't go out. Mm-hmm. So the Pope would say, and how could you survive if you don't have a propriety? And she said, very heroically, I must say, she said, we will survive of, come si dice, mendicità, of begging. Mm-hmm. Which you know what does it mean. I mean, if somebody was bringing them food, they mm-hmm. would eat. If there was nobody bringing food, they wouldn't eat. Mm-hmm. That was very hard. I mean, depending from the others mm-hmm. and having nothing. Or I think that the importance of her choice of poverty is not only an ascetic mm-hmm. Choice, but it is also the fact that the church, I mean the church as an authority, was controlling the convents through the money, through the propriety, through the use of the money. Mm-hmm. No? So refusing the money was refusing a control. This was the problem. It was not only a question of ascetical choice, mm-hmm. but it was a question that the church wanted to control through the money, through the donation, mm-hmm. through propriety. So the radical refuse of propriety was a sort of disobedience. That the title comes from that.
That's and we could learn a little bit about that today with our political action committees. The freedom from money obviously gives you a certain kind of freedom that clearly she had a hard time convincing people to respect. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that. To me, one of the most striking details that I learned from reading your book was that, the arc of Chiara's life, she's a very comes from a very rich, noble family in Assisi. She's supposed to get married to another nobleman. She, instead of getting married, she listens to the voice of San Francesco, and basically, is brought with his guidance and his help into what will become a monastery for women. On the day that or not the day, but the year that he receives his stigmata, she becomes very sick with an ailment that I guess in a way seems to have paralyzed her legs,
Yes,
renders her
right.
immobile. And so for 28 years, Claire is essentially bedridden and paralyzed, and she is continually fighting with the papacy to accept her rule. A rule I would like Dacia to say a little bit more about, but the detail that really struck me is that finally Innocent IV agrees to approve her rule of enclosure and poverty in her convent, and 2 days after the rule is approved, she dies. So it's this incredible willpower that you just see her exerting. She's fighting to live, despite this ailment that has affected her, until she literally has her way.
But in the same time, you see that there was the counter strategy, because so she obtained to have the consent of the church to her rule, but when she died, the rule was completely ignored. You see,
so she should have hung on there.
Yes, and the strategy was very, clever. Also, the strategy, the church strategy, the power strategy, because so in the same time they completely destroyed her will. But in the same time they made her saint. You see, so and you can understand that they were in a hurry, because she died in August. In October she was already made saint, which is very unusual, because usually it took 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, but they did it very quickly, because it was part of the strategy. So to make her saint, and in the same time to completely forget her will, you see. And you know why they made her saint? Not only for this reason, but also because she was very, very popular. She was popular and famous and loved by the people. Already the people considered her a saint, even if she was not officially saint. And she was loved for, I think, several reasons. First of all, because she was so faithful to her choices from the beginning to the end. She never changed. Secondary, because she practiced in the convent, she practiced democracy. I want to explain. In the convents, usually, the structure was exactly as it was in society. There was a vertical structure. On the top, there were the rich, the daughters of the rich people, of the rich and noble families. And then going down, the poorer. At the end, there were the daughters of the peasants, who were the servants of the others, you see. So there was exactly the same situation as it was in society. Well, Chiara, when she opened the convent, she said, I would never command. I don't want to command. We are all the same. We are equal. And she did it. She practiced it. And you know how she did it? She did it giving the example. She was the first to do all the humble works in the convent. That means, for example, taking the water from the well, taking care of the ill people, ill women who were in the convent, cooking, cleaning on the floor. Usually this thing never an abbess, badessa, abbess would have done. Never. So she gave an example, which was not only a religious example, it was a social example. That was very important on the side of Chiara. So she was not only a religious person, she was giving an example of another way of living in the society. First of all, democracy, so they were all the same. Secondary, poverty, that means the refusal of every kind of propriety, possession, everything. But this is interesting also. Not it was not come si dice, l'elogio, the
Lodging, where to stay.
lodge, no,
Praise.
praise,
Praise,
sì, the praise of poverty in a society divided between poor and rich. No, she said that everything that is in the world, every property, land, castles, everything, belonged to God. So it was for everybody. You see, it was a very, very revolutionary idea of property. She didn't accept property of nobody. But in the same time, she respected. This was the complicated, difficult, how can I say, contradiction. But it was the only way, because, you know, it was a totalitarian society. Then you couldn't, it's not like today you can choose to believe or not to believe, or to, you were inside or outside the church. There was nothing to do. You couldn't choose another way of being in your situation. No? So she was such an equilibrium, very difficult equilibrium, to be inside but also outside. I mean, to criticize without criticizing. And she was so strong that she did it. You know, she did it because she became a saint. Anyway, she was accepted by the church, even if her rule had been completely contradicted. But she, in a way, she succeeded. And you know, one way of success was the fact that the convents of Clarisse were multiplying. They are multiplicated. They were hundreds at a certain moment. She started with herself, two sisters. There were 3 persons. Then they became 30, and then 40, and 50, and then they had to open others. And they became so famous that at one moment it came from the daughter of the king of Bohemia, a letter saying, Agnese di Bohemia, asking asking her how she could open a convent similar to what she was living. So you understand how popular she was. That was important for the church.
And it's extraordinary to think that someone who is so enclosed has nonetheless that kind of fame in the world outside the convent.
Yeah,
I mean, how can that happen? I mean, that also seems to be a bit of a contradiction or a paradox.
It is a contradiction, yes. But, you know, things spread by words because there were no papers.
Sure.
But people were speaking about her because they recognized her fidelity to her ideas, her, what we would say today, idealism, il suo idealismo, which has been very strong and very clear and very, very courageous also. And the people recognized these characters, so she became famous for that.
Right. No, and what you've just said, I think, helps me understand one moment in your book where you say that the choice of poverty is un grandissimo progetto di libertà femminile, the extent to which, you know, this is not just about a person choosing poverty as a radical choice, it's about a woman choosing poverty as a radical choice. And so I guess, you know, my question in a way is whether or not her choice is therefore even more radical than St. Francis's. I mean, because she is a woman, does this make her choice, is this a progetto ancora più grande, one could say?
More radical,
because she's a woman.
Because she's a woman. Because, you see, when she opened the convent, she decided for the convent, she went away, she escaped from her house. During the night, she was 18 years old. Well, she thought that she was going to preach as St. Francis. Because, you know, Francis' choice was to go around and preach, no? And preach for the gospel. And she thought, and he agreed, because at the beginning of the church, there were women preaching, they were not. But then, at the moment in which she would have liked to go around and preach, the church didn't accept it. So she was forced to be prisoner of her convent, you see. And that's why it becomes more and more difficult to be free when you are closed in a convent. So the very interesting thing is that she couldn't go out, she couldn't preach, but in the same time, the people came to her, you see. She was there, but she became so popular, then the people were coming. And then there was the fact that she was healing. She made miracles. You know, they brought her children, mamoli, to be cured. They were ill, and she put her hand, and they were healed. So, you know, this is also something very important. It's not important to know if, I mean, medically, if it was not true or not. I think that when you really believe in something, this happens.
No, I think one of the richest things about your book is just the beautiful level of again, novelistic detail
Thank you.
That you've brought to it. And I think one of the most beautiful moments is where you're imagining one of the things that obviously Chiara did a lot, which was embroidery. You know, working with her hands.
Yeah,
Here she is, you know, in bed for 28 years. You know, what did she do? And this is a very rough and inelegant translation of a passage where you're speculating about what she would have embroidered. But with your permission, let me just read this little passage
yes,
because
please.
it lets us imagine a Claire who is, again, completely homebound,
Paralyzed.
but who also has or had at one point aspirations of going elsewhere. So again, you're talking about her doing her embroidery work, and you say, no one has ever told us what patterns she embroidered. It's likely they were fairly traditional images, such as vineyards and grapes, roses, perhaps laurel leaves, but perhaps also a blue sky to which a golden ladder led you, or angels with great wings ready for flight. Is it possible that her laborious hands, using the silent visual language of embroidery, shape some secret dream? I try to imagine what it might have been, the dream of flying, of seeing the world, of preaching the word of Christ, walking beneath the sun like Francis, rather than spending all day long on that disgusting palette to embroider covers for the altar. I'm sure that her designs were beautiful. I'm sure that her hand was bold and creative. Who can say that she didn't speak in that humble code reserved for female hands while her legs lay beneath her, immobile? It's just, again, this wonderful sense of, you know, a life that is static, but a mind and an imagination that is so rich. And a few pages later, you talk about the real liberty that Chiara had sought, the liberty of curiosity, of discovery, of knowledge, of wondering. And then you wonder, and I'd like to press you on this a little bit, you wonder if her immobility is, quote, the suppression of a sentiment that was in the main legitimate, her desire to go outside and to preach and to be like Francis, but which was considered dangerous and illicit, diabolical and presumptuous. Why were her legs paralyzed? Why not her heart, her mind, her hands? Perhaps as though she wanted to punish herself, the very parts that had inspired her to disobey. So it's this wonderful moment you're suggesting that maybe her paralysis is her own self-infliction of a punishment for wanting to do what she shouldn't do, which is to go out and be like Francis and preach.
Well, this is my imagination, because
It's a wonderful
you see,
thought.
I read a lot of things, but nobody knows what kind of illness she had. That's why I imagine it could be a sort of a symbolical illness, because I spoke with also doctors, and they say, well, it could be that, but in the same time, she was alive. She was also dealing the convent. She was not ill in the sense that she couldn't do things. And there is a very interesting episode in which there is an invasion of Assisi by the troops of Frederick II, and they come to the convent, they invade the convent, they call Saracini, and she was paralyzed as usual, and the nun goes to her and say, but what can we do? Because, you know, they were used to cut the throat to the people. So she says, well, take me up. So they are 4 nuns, they take her, and they bring her on the courtyard, how do you say?
The courtyard.
Courtyard. And she on her knees, she says, please go away, these people, preaching God. and they go away. And now it's incredible. This is considered one of her miracles. And they go away not only from the convent, but also from the town. Naturally, there are malicious interpretation. They say the convent was so poor, there was nothing
to steal.
nothing to steal, so they had to go away. Another explanation of some historian is that Frederick II was a very, very clever, intelligent man. He knew that she was very, very popular, and he didn't want his troops to disturb. I don't know. It's impossible to say. But it was considered also by canonization as one of her miracles, you see. And, well, another thing I want to say, because I think it's important, that what I learned more of her was from this book, which was published by a small publishing house of Assisi called La Porziuncola, which nobody knows around Italy. But they were the only one who have published the testimonies of the sisters of Chiara just 2 months after her death. So they are the only people who have lived with her. They really speak about the everyday life in the convent, which we don't know much about, no? And all the biography of Chiara have been written 100 years later. I think the one 70 years later. So it's very important for me it has been very important to read this testimony, because you can feel what was this life in the convent. And for me, I mean, I believe that the writer is nourished by details. So details are very important.
And again, it's the details that really make your
Very
book come to
important,
life.
yes.
And I think that, no, it's wonderful to have the nuns as witnesses. It's a female community talking about their most important member, and so I think that also is a way of taking away from the church its ability to create this narrative. And again, I do note that the details of convent life, you're very very rigorous and clear about. You talk about both, as you call the kind of the joy of living there, but also you say, but there was lice. Right, we have to think about the fleas, in the beds. We have to think about, again, the very poor quality of what little food that they did eat, the poor quality of the water, how much work it was to bring water in. So this was not like a paradise inside the convent. And you have a few pages where you reminisce very briefly, and I thought I might ask you a little bit about this, about what I think you suggest are comparable in your own life to the years that perhaps Chiara spent in her convent. And you reflect on 2 moments in your life, both as a young girl. One, when you spent 3 years, I guess, in the Collegio Fiorentino. But right before that, and I'm sure a much tougher moment, when you spent 2 years with your family in essentially a concentration camp in Japan. And I'm wondering if you might just share with us a little bit as to how and whether you drew on those memories to think through what life might have been like, again, in this very harsh world of Assisi in the 13th century.
Well, that experience has been very, very important for me, as you can imagine. And it has given a sort of, how can I say, sign in my life, in my memory. And from that moment, I was 2 years in the concentration camp in Japan. For those who don't know, my father was an anthropologist, and we were in Japan. I was a small girl, but he was studying a population of North Japan. And it was perfect. We were living very well, in very good terms with Japanese people. But then in 43, they asked all the Italian people who were living in Japan to sign the agreement to the Republic of Salò. So Italy was divided in 2 pieces. The south was already liberated, and there were the Americans, the English, and the other half was in the hand of the Nazis still. No, this line of division lasted 2 years. And so on the north there was a sort of civil war, and there were the partisans who were fighting to liberate from the Nazis, etc. So in Japan, they asked my father and my mother to sign this agreement. They didn't want to.
They were disobedient.
Disobedient, that's right, but not for political reasons, but because they couldn't accept racism. You know, well, an anthropologist can't be a racist, I would say. But anyway, they were particularly against racism. They hated racism. So they couldn't accept, and they were very, I must say, fair to, how do you say, fedeli, faithful to themselves. And they said, no, we don't sign. And so they took us and they brought us in a concentration camp, which was not I mean, it was not a exterminating concentration camp, but it was very, very, very hard, in the sense that they gave us enough just to survive. But hunger was terrible. And then the bombs, because they were bombing all the time, and then, well, hunger. I think that this kind of hunger is terrible, because when you are very, very hungry, you start to become ill. I mean, there are illness that come with lack of protein and vitamins. No? So we had beriberi, scorbuto, etc., etc. And so, from that moment, this has been a very important experience for me, and I remain very interested in reclusions. I mean, this is, for me, is a sort of, how can I say, curiosity, interest. I feel something that I want to know more. So from the beginning, I was interested in the reclusion of the convents, of the prisons, of the asylums, and I have written a lot of things about this situation, and also, naturally, concentration camps for example, in Poland. I have been many times to visit them, etc., etc. And I think this is the reason for which I'm interested in the convents, even if I'm not Catholic, practicing Catholic. But I would say, well, many people say, maybe you change your mind, you are becoming a Catholic. No, I'm not, but I think, you know Benedetto Croce, no? Benedetto Croce was a great philosopher, Italian philosopher, and he said, one time he said, we can't say that we are not Christians, no? That means that we are coming from a Christian culture, even if you are not believing. We are there, we come from there, we have this, how can I say, background, we have these le radici, roots. And so I think that we must know what happened. I mean, these things are very important. For example, this relation between the church, the church as a power, and the church as how the people were living as a poor people, or the choice of St. Francis, for example, or of Chiara, which was against the church as a power, as an empire, because the church was an empire, and it was armed. It was very strong and armed. And another thing that I understood, which is very interesting, that the more the church became powerful and the more the church became armed, the more becomes misogynist. At the beginning, the church is very respectful to women, and going on, the more become powerful and strong and conquering around and making crusade, etc., etc., women are put aside.
No, and that comes through in a very powerful section of your book, where you talk about, among others, you know, one of the first female martyrs, Saint Perpetua. You then talk about many other saints who come later. So in addition to being a story about Santa Chiara, this is also, I think, a very rich history about women who both were nurtured by this original, very radically revolutionary aspect of the church, very egalitarian
Yeah.
philosophy of the church, which eventually gets eroded, as you point out, certainly by the time that Claire is writing.
And that's why she was referring herself all the time to the gospel. She didn't never speak about the fathers of the church, I padri della Chiesa, because she knew that even if they were saints, etc., their idea about women are, you can see there, is really terrible. I mean, it's very punishing and also contradictory, because on one side they would say that women were very fragile, very weak, they were like children forever, minors forever, and they have to be guided and protected. On the other side, they would say that that the women were dangerous, very strong, very dangerous, very diabolic, so it was a contradiction. But they believed in that. They believed in that.
One of the things about convent life for Chiara that you point out, which makes a nice contradiction with your own life and maybe with your interest in her, is you suggest at one point that this was a convent in which you haven't been able to find any books other than the breviary or the offices, right? And again, I'm just going to very briefly translate a passage toward the end of your book where you're talking about yourself and your obvious passion for books as a novelist, as a dramaturg, as someone who has been involved very deeply in the literature of Italy, for half a century. Certainly one of the most prolific writers today. And I just love this passage because it seems to clash. Well, obviously it says a great deal about you, but it also is a real contrast with the woman of Chiara that you present here as someone who didn't seem to be interested in books, or at least, you say at one point, did she know how to read? We don't know. But here's what you write about yourself, and again, with my poor translation. What would I do without my books? I have a house full of them, and still, they're never enough. I'd like to have a day of 36 hours to be able to read at my pleasure. I have books of all sizes, pocketbooks, books that will fit in my suitcase, books that will fit in my purse, on my shelf, on my coffee table. And I'm always carrying one with me. One never knows if one might find a moment to read. If they make me wait in some office, the post office or the doctor, I take out my book and read. When I have my nose in a book, I never feel the fatigue of waiting. And like Ortega y Gasset says, I make myself at home in a book, and it's difficult to unhouse me. I emerge from books with my pupils dilated. I love that image. I consider reading the greatest, the most profound, the most reliable pleasure of my life. It's just, again, a lovely praise of reading here, not just of, certainly of disobedience. But again, here we have a Santa Chiara who not only perhaps didn't read herself, but certainly didn't seem to encourage reading among her sisters. And in fact, there's a passage in her rule, which is a very brief rule, in which she kind of separates out the sisters who can read from the sisters who cannot read. So the sisters who can read, she writes, shall celebrate the divine office. For this they may have breviaries. Those who do not know how to read shall say 24 Our Fathers, and goes on to a list of other prayers. But there's no sense here that she wants to encourage the act of reading. She doesn't want to teach the women who can't read how to read. And so I'm just curious about this. Obviously they're reading Latin, right? I mean, at this point the vernacular is literally being born as St. Francis is writing some of his prayers in his Umbrian dialect. But I'm just curious about this. How do you deal with a Santa Chiara who doesn't share or didn't seem to share your interest, as it were, in the book?
Well, it was because she referred to the gospel. And many times you can see, you can read that Christ also was very suspicious about books and about learning, about what called i dotti. And but I think that maybe she didn't read, but she came from a family of readers. Her mother, because there are two mothers who are very important in this story. One is the mother of St. Francis, who was French, by the way. Her name was Pica de Bourlemont, and she was a very cultivated woman. She had read the important book of that moment, in which were, for example, Chanson des Gestes, La Chanson de Roland, Ilaïs de Maria de France, Chrétien de Troyes, etc. And she was she was very important in the life of Francis. Many of his words and his feelings you can find in the culture of the Provençal culture, you see, which was in that moment the advanced, the avant-garde culture coming from France, and it was very important. And she was, come si dice, impregnato.
Well, with the desire to,
Yeah.
or the empeño, right? Of doing
No,
something.
she knew. No, impregnato means that like a sponge.
Like a sponge. Okay, soaked up.
Soaked
up, right.
Soaked of this culture, even if she didn't speak about it, and she read a lot. So I'm sure that there was an influence. On the other side, there was another mother, because there are two important mothers. The mother of Chiara was of an important family. Her name was Ortolana Fiumi, and also naturally there are no list of books, but she knew. We know that she knew about books and this kind of books, and by the way, she made a very courageous choice. She went alone, walking to the La Terra Santa, to the Saint. How do you say?
The Holy Land.
Holy Land, to see where Christ was born. She went alone. She went alone, and it was an act of great courage in that moment, you know, because traveling was very difficult, very risk. There was a great risk to travel, specifically for a woman alone, because you know they were traveling in a group of people. Pilgrimage was very common. They were pilgrim, but they were groups of people going all together to defend themselves. She went alone with a friend, another woman, and so there was a risk. I mean, they were full of brigands, and you know, they had to. There were no roads. You had to sleep in incredible places. So it was a very great adventure, and she did that. She went to.
So maybe Chiara was reacting to her mother's adventurousness.
Maybe.
By locking herself in the convent.
No.
I'm
Locking
joking.
herself was not her choice.
Right.
She would have liked
Right.
to go around, but she couldn't because the church wouldn't accept. And you know, that's another thing. In the beginning, in the church, there were the diaconess who were preaching. They were going around. It was accepted. But then several popes made the decision that all the female convents should be closed. They had to be closed, you see. Come si chiamava? There was a pope who made it as a law of the church. Bonifacio VIII, which, by the way, have been put in hell by Dante, not for this reason, but for other reasons. But he was a very authoritarian person, and he made the church become very authoritarian. And he decided all the female convents should be closed. So she couldn't move, but she would have liked to go around and preach. That I imagine that's why she was paralyzed.
Right. No. Again, and that's a lovely theory that you have. I was wondering if we could bring this up to date a little bit in terms of why Claire now, in the 21st century, and just to go back to again your extremely creative and imaginative structure of your book, how you are supposedly writing emails with this young Chiara Mandala, and I'm prepared to believe this is a fiction. However, when I went to your website, and there's a wonderful website that Dacia maintains, and there's a part of it called Forum. And if you go to Forum, you find out that not only do her many fans write her letters and questions, but she answers them. So I'm imagining that perhaps Chiara Mandala perhaps wrote you on Forum.
Yes, you're right.
And gave you the initial idea about writing Chiara. Is this true, or is this
true?
a fiction? It is true.
No, it's true.
Oh, well,
I
say
mean,
more about that.
The beginning is true.
Okay, that's marvelous.
Started the idea is true. It was a letter by a girl.
That's wonderful.
Who was saying, you see, I'm very uneasy with my body, uneasy with myself, uneasy with sex. I believe that sex is violence today, and I'm afraid. I'm a virgin, and I'm anorexic. And I was very astonished by this letter because she was very sincere and courageous to say these things. And so the beginning was true. Then I lost her. She didn't write anymore.
So she does disappear.
Yes, she disappeared.
Wow.
But I went on making a character. For all the end is naturally is not true. But it became for me a character. She was there, and I said, well, I must develop this character. And so she became more and more present and more important for me while she was disappearing.
Wow, that's no, that's lovely, and you know, it raised for me both the issue about Chiara's relevance today and the way that you make Chiara of Assisi relevant today, but also the trickier issue as to what we own and what we don't own. And I think what's lovely about the way that your introductory section is structured is that you don't want to write this book, right? You say, I have nothing to do with the Middle Ages. I don't know about saints. I'm not religious. Little by little, she's drawing you, into this project. You finally say, I think it's page 39, you say, inutile dire che sono stata contagiata, right? I mean, it's useless to say I've been literally contaminated, right, by your affection for St. Clair. And it does raise the question about who owns the idea of this book. Is this your idea? Was this young girl's idea? Is this your book? Is it hers? And I think by extension, to think about St. Clair. Is this a life that she has chosen for herself? Is this her rule? Is this what she can take ownership of? Or, as you asked this question at one point, you say, I can't say if it really was her choice or if it was a destiny imposed on her by heaven. And there's this wonderful metaphor that you use about the Sicilian Chiara Mandalas knocking at your door. She knocks, and you finally, just one day open and let her in. And like I said, I think it raises some interesting questions about the propriety or the possession of, in this case, intellectual life and intellectual ideas. Is this your idea? Is it Chiara's idea? Was it Chiara of Assisi's idea to choose poverty? Was it Francis's idea for her? Or does it matter, finally?
No, I think it was an idea of the community that was going around. I mean, it's not an invention neither of Francis, neither of Chiara. It was something that was going around in Europe in that moment. It was the advanced idea, which was the idea of going back to the gospel, to Christ, to another church, because the people didn't like that church, what the church has become, as a powerful church. You can imagine that Innocent IV, Innocenzo IV, was the Pope who decided officially to accept torture. It was so against the idea of Christ. Christ says you have to love the other person. Christ says if you are hit, you give the other cheek, and it's completely another world. They are referring to the gospel, but they are not faithful at all. They are going so far, and also the crusade, were a very strange thing and unacceptable for those who believed in the Christ's words. You see, there is an example, a very interesting episode in which they were preparing a crusade, one of the crusades, and Francis went because to go to Palestine, they were passing through Egypt. So he went to Egypt, to Damietta, and he said to the crusade, please let me speak with the other side, the Sultan. So he went to the Sultan, and when the Sultan was, all gold and important person with all his soldiers, he saw this little man, because St. Francis was small, ugly. Not, not what we see in the movies. Beautiful young man. No, he was ugly with the orecchia sventola, with a twisted mouth. He was not at all handsome at all, and he was poor with bare feet. how can you say, like a beggar, no? So when he saw this man, he said, "Who are you?" But you know, he had a great, how can I say, capacity of speaking. He had he could, and when he was speaking, everybody was enchanted by his speaking, because he has a wonderful voice and he was capable of communication. So he said to the Sultan, "But why we have to kill each other? Why don't we deal? Why don't we make an agreement? Why don't we speak each other? You have another religion and we have another religion, but maybe we could stay together. I mean, why we have to kill each other?" Which is, I mean, very intelligent. And the Sultan was maybe persuaded by this discourse, but unfortunately, the other people behind, the Crusaders, wanted to do the war. They wanted strongly to go to the war. They were all full of arms. You know, they were this, come si chiamano, iron
Armored,
thing.
had their armor on.
Yes, yes. And they wanted to do, and they went to the war. The crusade went on, and it was a disaster. That one, 5,000 people died in that occasion. Even children, people had nothing to do with the war. So he was right in a way, no? But this was the church. I mean, the church arrived to believe, to become an empire who wanted to conquer new people, new land, new situation, and those who were saying, but Christ didn't say that, you see. So there was a sort of very strong contradiction that I think we have to understand in that moment. You couldn't choose not to be how can I say, out of this question. You were inside or outside. You were pro or against. So being against the crusade, being against the war, was very courageous. Was very. You could be put in a tribunal and condemned
and tortured
and condemned.
Right.
So it was very clever on the side of St. Francis and Chiara to keep to their idea, their choices, and to not accept this the ideology of the church.
And I think that gets me to perhaps my last question. Stefano, I don't know if you'd like the audience to have a chance to ask questions, but I was just wondering, you know, kind of along the lines of what Chiara of Assisi means for us today. And I think that you have your Chiara, your letter-writing Chiara, saying at one point, toward the very end, you know, actually it's toward the beginning, when she's still trying to persuade you to write, she says, "If Chiara of Assisi hadn't existed, we would all today be more," and you use the word volgari, you know, so less refined, you know, less cultured, and more alone, which maybe would also translate well as lonely, you know, soli.
Solely.
Without Claire," she goes on, "there wouldn't be the other Italy, an Italy of refined passions, and a poverty chosen as an act of the heart's freedom." And I love this idea of, you know, freedom of expression here that Chiara is said to have embraced. And so I guess, again, and I'd like to open things up for the audience, but my last question right now might be, do you agree with that? Without Claire, what wouldn't we have, and what do we have instead?
Well, you know, Chiara is the representation of another Italy. I mean, an Italy which is idealistic, which is faithful to a choice till the end, courageous, and well, you know, this is the extreme contradiction with the stereotype of Italy, in which everything is possible, nobody cares, ideas are not so important, etc., which is not true, because there is another Italy which existed in those days, but exists even today, even if it's not so visible, you see. So I think it's very important to give visibility to a model. She is a model in a way. She's a model of a very strong and courageous Italy, which I like, which I believe that exists, but sometimes is covered by another Italy, which is vulgar, which is cynical, which is, you know, the Italy that unfortunately is the Italy of the stereotype. The stereotype exists, and certainly there is something behind, but sometimes we don't know what is, how many women and men have sacrificed themselves for ideas, you know, not only for their interest, but also for idea. This I call idealismo, no? Idealism, which is choosing an idea and being faithful, defending this idea till the end, which, by the way, my parents did in the moment in which there was a fashion. And I must say, all the Italians who were in Japan, I mean, not all, but the majority, signed for the Repubblica di Salò, because they said, oh, it's not important, it's a formality. And they say, no, if we are faithful to our idea, it's more important to be faithful to our idea than to accept just to sign as because it's a formality. So I think that we need example of this kind, very, very strong, very important to have models, you see. And we have models, like, for example, Falcone, no? The magistrate who had been killed, is a model. And it's very important for Italian society to have this model, because he knew, you know, there is an interview of Falcone by a French journalist who said, but are you not afraid? And he said, you see my bottom? My life is worth this bottom. You see? I know. I know that I can be killed any moment. He knew that. But I will go on. You see? But for me, these are the person. I mean, naturally, you can't ask everybody to be heroes. I don't pretend that. But it's important to have some models which are this kind of models, which go on, keeping their fidelity to their ideas. Thank you.
Stefano is getting the mic ready to hand out. I was just going to say that you mentioned, as a kind of parenthesis, that perhaps the new Pope Francis is in this category. I think you say he's a sassolino nell'ingranaggio, right? You know, he's there to kind of put his nose into places where it shouldn't be, like the Vatican Bank. So, fortunately, unlike you know, the heroic Falcone, he's still with us, and perhaps able to be a model for idealists.
I think the Pope is doing a very important job, and just the name that he chose for himself, that no Pope never had chosen this name.
And he's disobedient.
Disobedient, yes, that's right. And he's asking for transparency, you know, and starting with the money, with
Which goes back to Claire refusing the money.
With the bank, with the bank. Yes, and poverty.
And he wants to include women, to give women.
That's right, that's right. So he is in the sense of Francis, in a way. He wants to renovate the church from inside, not destroying the church, because also Francis and Chiara didn't want to destroy the church, but they want to change it from the beginning. They want to go back to the Christ. They want to go back to the gospel. And I think that it could be, and I think that many persons in Italy, specifically young people, feel in this sense.
Are you going to send him a copy of the book?
Yes, I don't want to be presumptuous, but
Maybe he's already read it.
I don't know.
Questions?
Yes.
Yes, staying on the relationship between Chiara and Francis, I'm wondering if I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but I have a copy here, and I will read it very religiously. And I'm wondering if you touch on the issue of Chiara being one of two, because it's a very peculiar thing in the history of mysticism, I think, that a man and a woman are part of the creation of new orders and a new movement within the church. I mean, I can think of Saint Benedict and Saint Scholastica, for example, even though it's a very different relationship there. And then there's Saint John of the Cross and Saint Teresa of Avila, but it's a very peculiar thing that doesn't happen very frequently. And I'm wondering if when you deal with the issue of gender, for example, you deal with this with the fact that they are a couple. She's one of two.
Well, it's complicated because he was very, Francis was aware that there was this danger to being considered a couple. He didn't want to be accused of being near to a woman, and so he refused to go to the convent. For example, they were always asking him, please come to the convent, to the San Damiano, which was the Clarissal convent, and he never went there. And at the last years, he said, I will come when I will die. And it is true that when he died, they brought his body to the convent, and all the nuns were there crying on his body. He avoided to go. So it was, maybe he wanted to take a distance, not to be considered a couple. That was his preoccupation, I think, because, it was easy to accuse a man to be too near to a woman. And he had so many accusers. He was attacked, He was, now we consider a saint, he's very famous, etc. But at the beginning, he has been attacked. He was been accused of everything. He was in a very difficult situation. Also, St. Francis had been saved by popularity because he was joined, but from many young people in Assisi at the beginning, and then all Italy. But at the beginning, they considered him a fool. They considered him a madman and somebody dangerous, and somebody who was acting, he was joking, also because he had a side of joyfulness, no? And you can see it in the wonderful poem, one of the most beautiful poems that have been written in Italian language, which was Il Cantico delle Creature, when he speaks about the sister sun, sister moon, in English, but sorella luna, fratello sole. And also he says, sorella morte, sister death, He's this kind of joyfulness. And he says also in his rule, if you read the rule, he says that the priest, i frati should be joyful. He said, be joyful. So he was considered out of the church. So he had a very hard life, and I think that he avoided to see Chiara, even if he was very much, he felt very much for her, but friendship, I don't know, maybe also love, but I don't know, but he took distance. Very, I think he was maybe afraid of being accused of ambiguity. Yes.
You gave us first of all, thank you for your beautiful presentation, and you gave us such precious insight into your personal life. How much of Dacia Maraini is inside Chiara?
Well, certainly my experience of reclusion have been important. I mean, it has been something that I know, an experience that I know. And so I took from for example, the experience of poverty. I know what it is. I know with my body. So it was useful for me to describe poverty. For example, I try to imagine Chiara that was coming from a family, a wealthy family. She was using wonderful shoes, wonderful dresses. And when she chose poverty, she leaves everything. And she goes bare feet. They were going every day, bare feet. And there were no carpets,
Rugs,
and drugs. It was stones, you know, and cold in the winter, hot in the summer. And I was thinking, how long did it take to become used to go around bare feet? It had been hard for him, I'm sure of that. And for example, the fact that they were infested by animals, mice, for example, lots of mice. There is an episode which is beautiful. I find it very beautiful. Well, it was forbidden to keep animals, even a hen for eggs. No animals, because it was a propriety. So they did. But at certain moments, there is a small cat, la gattuccia, which is tolerated because why? Because she was going against the mice. She was chasing, hunting mice. You see, so there is this certain moment. There is the apparition of this little gattuccia, and the gattuccia makes a miracle. That means that she is in bed, Chiara, in bed, always paralyzed, and she needs a piece of cloth because she had to broider. And she calls, but nobody comes. And so she said to the gattuccia, "Take me that cloth, please, there." And the gattuccia goes and brings her the cloth. And this is listed as a miracle of Santa Chiara in the canonization.
A dog you would believe, but not a cat.
Yes. Which was, I found so sweet and so tender.
That's great.
Yes, please. Gattuccia.
Good evening. Signora Maraini, I'm very honored to meet you tonight. I'm from Bulgaria, so I'm particularly, proud to have one of the greatest intellectual person actually living in Europe, I would say. Besides, I know very well your story, and because I'm into culture, Sicilian culture and art. And I don't know if you people know that Dacia Maraini had a wonderful mother, not only in terms of aesthetic, but she was a great painter. And she did some futurism together with some others, but she chose to be together with Guttuso, one of your friend, I believe. And I'd like to know, for instance, how you're still attached to Sicily besides the experience you had with Bagheria that you wrote in 1993, if I'm right.
Yes.
And what if you please can go back to our roots and see, for example, what's good is remain in some part of the church. For example, you wrote something about Franciscan, which I love. I had the fortune to go to the Franciscan, they call Francescani Rinnovati, which started in Sicily, living the Franciscan way, that the roots, living in the wagons of trains. And then they transferred some of them in Corleone, the city of evil. Not because Corleone, they depict us the evils, because we Sicilians, when they're bad, we evils. When we're good, we're good Italians. Unfortunately, still continue. So there's a beautiful experience of this Francescan. They still live like Francesco when he was, living. And And there is a way from you to pay attention a particular character that I met. I mean, I had the occasion to meet there, no, to know about it, which is Brunetto Latini, who became a saint from Corleone, because people know the bad things about Corleone, but they don't know that Corleone had a saint and then had a pope, I believe, right? So if there is, this kind of research to your roots to bring what is beautiful and what is great about our country. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. No, yes, you're right. Usually we know the best, the bad, and we don't know the good things. Bagheria, by the way, is true. It has been a small town in which mafia has been very important. But in the same time, it's given birth to very important people as painters, filmmakers, poets, and Tornatore is from Bagheria, Guttuso is from Bagheria. They are poets. Butita is a very important poet, etc. So sometimes we don't realize. And I must say that also on the side of population, I go often in Bagheria. I have lots of friends, and there are very courageous people who are fighting the mafia, who are, for example, I went to a school lately. I went to a school in which this school decided, all the pupils of the school, they divided in groups, and they are becoming, how do you say, the observers of the town. That means that they take care of a garden, of a school, of a library, and if something happens, they put together and they protest, they go to the administrators, etc., etc. And I found it very interesting. This comes from the base. I mean, this comes from the population. And a lot of extraordinary people in Bagheria. So we don't, also Corleone, I'm sure of that. But naturally, we know Rina is from Corleone, and we identify Corleone with Rina, which is not right, because they are, this is what Chronicle gives us. But it's true that Bagheria specifically, it's full of people, artists.
Do you know the story of Bernardo Latini?
Sì, sì, certo. And all the artists, there are so many artists coming from Bagheria. So I think that you're right. We should know better about these people who have done good to the small town of Bagheria. Thank you for your question. There was another person down there. Yes.
I have a short question about the title of the book. The book, if I'm not wrong, is Chiara di Assisi, and so there is Chiara without the saint before. And how much is this kind of, this choice influenced by the fact that Chiara is probably a figure of authority rather than power? And what kind of, I think that to put like saint before Chiara is like a kind of how the church institutionalized, her figure, and is a way of, from the power position, to take someone that is a very, an author of her life, and also a different voice inside the power. So how much there is this kind of relationship between authority and power in your book, and as you mentioned, it's also a book for Italy, to have a different kind of narration, different kind of figure. How much is important to have this kind of authority rather than, like to find something else rather than power that we have today?
Yes, maybe I didn't put the word saint in the book because it's not a biography, it's not a hagiography. I wanted to tell a story about a woman, first of all, a courageous, and I admire this woman. I think it comes out from the book.
Absolutely.
So it's not a criticism, but I wanted to give it more important to the woman than to the saint. Also because the church is very easy in making saints. In this moment we know that the two last popes are becoming saints. So it's not really, I mean, what I ask is a story of a person who really gives an example of what she has done. And I think that what she has done and how she lived and how she fought against the authority of the church is very impressive. I mean, because you have to think of those days, you know. And today it's very easy to think that everybody can choose what he wants, but in those days you couldn't. There were no possibility, and even the life of a woman was very, very, how can I say, conditioned. You would be married at 13 years old with somebody that you didn't know, that you didn't love, even know, usually was very much older than the girl, and every year you had to give birth to a child, and these children, half of them died. This was the rule, and very often, even the mother would die when there are so many births. She could die. You know that there is a study on just this period in which they say that the population was majority of male because women were dying of giving birth. So many, that the population was growing as the men were many more than women, because when you had every year how do you say, childbirth, there was a possibility, you know, it was easy to die of childbirth. So you can understand how difficult it was for a woman to live. I mean, and then the life was very short. I mean, a person at 30 years old was considered old, and they died at 40. 50 was already an exception. So there is a moment in which they say avanzò un vegliardo di 50 anni. Vegliardo, I don't know how do you say vegliardo?
Very old man.
Vegliardo is more than an old man. It's something. Vegliardo is something. Today we would say of somebody of 100 years old. No, so
Ancient. I think we get it across. Ancient. Yeah.
So it came out an ancient of 50 years old. Today is a young boy. I mean, he's a young person. You see. So you have to think about how life was hard and difficult. Specifically for a woman.
You have a wonderful moment where you say life in the convent was actually a lot less dangerous than life just in the world.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
They weren't having children, for one thing.
Yes, that's right. And also they had more time.
Right.
That's why very often you find writers between the nuns, then between the women, normal women, wife. In the lifetime, because they had no time. They had to have a child every year, and it was very difficult. So they had children all the time, and even if they had servants, they had to take care.
So wonderful to have you here tonight.
Thank you.
I was captivated by your word, by the usage of your word as radical. And it's interesting because human history in different periods of time asks for different kind of people. And you even use the word heroes in a different context. But I was just curious to know what you think, some sort of comparison, or maybe not comparison, but at this point of time, you know, is there still need? And as much as history has changed from the time of Chiara to today, is there room in today's world, in women's world, for some sort of radical behavior? And there could be across the board, political, social, activism, arts, anything.
Thank you. It's a very Nice question. I think yes. I think that yes, there is a need of models, and but what I liked in Chiara is that her radicalism is not enraged. She's never say the word of hate. She never hates anybody. For example, she refused to command, as I said, and she refused to punish. But she had the right to punish, and usually the abbes were punishing those who were not accepted the rules. She refused to punish. She would pass a night, entire night, speaking with the person to convince, because she believed in dialogue, she believed in convincing. And she was always very kind, gentle, she was sweet. That is so I like this in her radicalism. It's true that she was radical. She was very, very, very strong and stubborn in her decision to be faithful to her poverty, for example, choice of poverty, but never with rage, never with aggressiveness. She was very sweet and kind and peaceful and serene person. And this I found wonderful, because it's difficult to be both. Because usually radical persons are aggressive and violent, and they want to, they want to fight. She was fighting, but without being aggressive. And I find this is admirable, and it's not so usual.
I'm afraid this is all the time we have for tonight. I just have two small announcements. The first one is that copies of the book are for sale upstairs with Rizzoli, and Mrs. Maraini will be happy to sign them for you at the end of the event. And I also want to mention that here at Casa Italiana we have an Italian book club. They meet a couple of times a month, once a month, and it's an open group. It's free to everybody. They read a contemporary Italian book. There is no teacher. They divide the responsibilities in presenting the book. If you're interested, Marilyn, that you see there, wave your hand, Marilyn. You can ask for more information to Marilyn, who is one of the participants in the book club. They're currently reading The Leopard, that is a book of another great Sicilian author. And I would like to thank, for this wonderful evening and for this very, very deep discussion, Jane Tylus and Dacia Maraini. Thank you.